Yo, Kpaceguy here. Hey, so we're going to talk about crossover. More importantly, where you set your crossover. A question that I get almost all the time is, do I set my crossover on my AV receiver or do I set my crossover on my subwoofer or both? Which one should I do? So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about shortly what a crossover is, and then we're going to talk about why you don't want to set it on both the subwoofer and the AV receiver. So let's get right into it. First, we need to know what a crossover is. In short, a crossover is a setting inside your AV receiver and also on the back of your subwoofer plate amp that allows you to set certain frequency limitations for that speaker. So for example, if I have a floor standing speaker that plays, let's say 60 hertz, that's the lowest it can reach is down to 60 hertz. Well, I want to set a crossover point to protect my speaker from playing lower than 60 hertz. So I would set mine maybe 65, 70, 75 hertz and cross it over into the subwoofer that can handle those low notes. So a crossover is literally that. You're crossing over certain frequencies to a different speaker that can handle them and vice versa. Usually speakers to the subwoofer is your crossover. You can also set crossover for individual speakers. So like I said, if my floor standing speakers can't play under 60 hertz, well, I want to cross them over. I want to stop them from playing 60 hertz and lower to protect them, especially at higher volumes. So a crossover is just a setting that you set all your speakers to make sure that they're playing only the frequencies that they're able to play and nothing more, so that they're protected, especially at loud volumes. So there are two types of crossovers in audio: a high pass crossover and a low pass crossover, also known as a low pass filter and a high pass filter. They do two different things. So on your floor standing speakers, your main bed layer speakers, anything that's not a subwoofer has a high pass crossover. So when you go into your ADR and you're setting your crossover for each speaker, you're effectively changing the high pass filter, meaning all the low frequencies under what you set are not able to play. So if I go to my receiver and set my front left speaker to 60 hertz, anything under 60 hertz starts to drop off really quickly to the point where it's not playing anything at all. And the point of setting a high pass filter is to make sure that a speaker isn't playing too low and you risk blowing your speakers, generating heat, distortion, all sorts of things. It even takes a little bit of work off your amplifiers if you're not playing low bass, because low bass takes a lot of power. So if you're setting a high pass filter, you're basically protecting a speaker from playing sub frequencies. A low pass filter is the opposite. It only lets low frequencies play. So a low pass filter is what you set your subwoofer to. So if you set your sub to 80 hertz, that's a low pass filter. Now everything 80 hertz and above starts to fall off. It's no longer allowed to play much over 80 hertz. That's your low pass filter. So a high pass filter lets all the high frequencies through. A low pass filter lets all the low frequencies through, depending on what you set it at. So that's in short what those two do. Now, let's talk about the subwoofer in particular. On the back of your subwoofer, you have a volume knob, you have a phase switch, you probably have a standby auto or on switch, but you also have a crossover dial, usually 40 hertz to 180 or 40 to 150, something like that. And this is your low pass filter. As you start to turn that knob clockwise, you start to allow more frequencies to play. So the higher you turn that number, the higher frequencies your subwoofer will now play. The lower you turn that knob, the less high frequencies your sub will play. So if I set my dial to 80 hertz, it'll play 80 hertz and lower. If I set my crossover dial to 40, it'll play 40 hertz and lower. Now it does still play a little bit above that number. It's not a complete cutoff. It does slightly gradually roll off depending on your sub or your AV receiver. So now that we know what the crossover is and the different types of crossover, you may notice that on your subwoofer, you have that dial, but you also have a crossover setting in your AV receiver or preprocessor. And you may be wondering, Kpaceguy, do I set 80 hertz crossover on my sub and my ADR, or just one or the other? You want to pick one. Me personally, I've always chosen my AVR or preprocessor to set my sub crossover. The reason being is because when you're in the menus, you'll see a section for crossovers for all your speakers there. It only makes sense just to set everything all in one place. You don't have to remember to go back to your sub and make adjustments. You can do it right there from your remote in your AV receiver. So I personally use my AV receiver as where I make my crossover changes. I do not use the sub. So why would you not want to do both? Well, like I said, things gradually roll off. So if you choose 80 hertz on your subwoofer, nothing above that is going to play. Not much of it is going to play. But if I set 80 hertz on my sub and then go to my AV receiver and also do 80 hertz, well, now I'm going to add a hole in my sound. What do I mean by that? Well, here's an example. If I set my sub to 80 hertz, it doesn't just not play 80 hertz. It still plays 90, still plays 100, still plays 110, but it has a slow, maybe 3 or 6 dB roll off, maybe even a 12 dB roll off per octave, right? So it still plays a little bit above what I set, but it starts to get quieter and quieter as we grow in frequency. If I set the same crossover here, let's say my sub is a negative 12 dB slope, and so is my receiver. Now I have a negative 24 dB slope going on because this is a crossover set here that's cutting off frequencies, and my sub is also cutting off frequencies, and that's too much. You're doubling on your cutoff. You want your crossover to gradually roll off. You don't want it to be a dead stop at 80 hertz. You want it to still play 85, 90, 95, and give yourself a nice blend with the rest of your speakers. But if you have your crossover set on your sub and on your AV receiver, well, it's going to send a cutoff to your sub, and then your sub is going to cut that off even more. And now you're kind of missing that roll off. Now it's just a steep stop. And that's not good for your sound. You want to blend those frequencies with the rest of the speakers, and you can't if you have a hard cutoff on your crossover. That's why we have what we call a slope. Meaning, if your frequency is like this, it slowly starts to roll off. It doesn't just go here and just go gone, right? We don't want that. And that's essentially what you cause when you set them to both. So if you're going to be like me and set your crossover in your AV receiver, what do you do with the sub crossover? Well, depending on your sub, you may have an LFE input and an LFE mode on your crossover. If you do, you want to turn your crossover dial all the way to LFE. That essentially disables the crossover built into your subwoofer amplifier and relies on the crossover in your AV receiver. Now, don't worry, if you have a sub that doesn't have an LFE crossover, you can get the same exact effect by just turning up your crossover all the way to its highest setting. And then you can cross it over here in your AVR. That way, you're opening up the frequencies in your amp so that it has no type of play in what you're doing here. You're essentially bypassing your subwoofer's crossover, and now it's relying on the signal it's getting from your AVR via your subwoofer cable or wireless adapter. So that's what I personally do. Set my crossover here, turn it all the way up to max on the sub. That way the sub has no play in the frequency response. It's all in one spot in my AVR. And I can sit down in my position, grab my remote, grab my calibration mic, and I can make adjustments right here from my receiver instead of going to the sub, pulling it out, getting back there, twisting the knob, sitting down, listening, not liking it, going back to the sub, turning it up a little bit more. You don't have to do that. You can just set it all here on your AVR, take a seat, listen, and just make adjustments with your remote. I think that's just the most convenient thing to do, and by just that alone is good enough for me to just keep all my crossovers here. But you can use your sub. If you're going to use your subwoofer as your crossover, then you want to set the highest setting on your AVR. So depending on what you want to do, if you want to use your AVR for your crossover, set the highest crossover on your sub. If you want to use your sub as your crossover, then set the highest setting on your AVR. One or the other. Do not do both because you will cause yourself a very quick roll off and you might have a hard time blending your sound. And we don't want that, right? We don't want that kind of thing. So that's my take on it. Leave me a comment down below and let me know, what are you using as your crossover point? Are you using your sub to set your crossover, or are you using your AVR? Let me know that down below in the comment section. Like this video, hit that subscribe button, and we will see you in the next one. Kpaceguy out. Peace.